And we're thrilled to have in conversation with us today His Excellency Mohammed Al-Jadaan, the Finance Minister of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. His Excellency Sheikh Salman Al-Khalifa is the Minister of Finance and National Economy at the Kingdom of Bahrain. Kristalina Georgieva is Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. His Excellency Andrew Griffith, the Economic Secretary to the Treasury in the United Kingdom, and His Excellency Mehmet Şimşek, the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Turkey. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us. Your Excellency, I'll begin with you. As we look at these new conflicts in the region, how will Saudi Arabia balance domestic economic growth with rising regional instability?
Thank you very much for having me. Is it working? And thank you, everyone, for being here. I will try to be brief, although it's very difficult, really, to be brief in these circumstances. Let me start with a positive note. For countries to be able to help others, they need to be strong. And that was our focus since the launch of the Vision 2030, is to try and make sure that Saudi economy is strong enough to support its own people, its own economy, but then to be able to support others. If you are not strong enough, if you don't have enough buffers, you will not be able to help yourself or others. The world went through multiple shocks with COVID, post-COVID, supply chain disruption, significant quantitative easing, a lot of money was thrown through COVID, which then resulted in inflation, which then resulted in monetary tightening and rising interest rates, which led to a very difficult situation depending on which part of the world you are in. Some countries are able to deal with it. Some countries are having difficulties, and they consumed a lot of their buffers to deal with these multiple shocks and even overlapping shocks. And the recent events does not actually help at all. Our sympathy goes to those who are suffering, civilians, civilian casualties wherever they are. International law needs to be respected. And without an international law being respected, the world will be in chaos. So we need to calm, we need wisdom, we need to collaborate to bring calm and make sure that we de-escalate. We have seen this in the region where before 7th of October, a lot of de-escalation have happened, which brought a lot of hope for the region, and we don't want the recent events to derail that. So we are making a lot of efforts with our partners to ensure that we go back to where we are and continue the development path. The sad thing is, the most suffering part of this is actually low-income countries. And we need to make sure that we provide them the support is needed, and for that to happen, we need collaborative approach, and we need multilateral development institutions to help us through that process.
Your Excellency, the projections for Saudi Arabia's economy have already been revised down. Are you concerned that this may cause economic fragmentation risks as a result of this new conflict and these new tensions?
Obviously, we have witnessed fragmentation for some time now. And few numbers which actually would illustrate where we are. One is with trade restrictions and what is called friendshoring, the more trade restriction, the more low-income countries suffer. Actually, it is proven scientifically through research that the more trade restriction that exists, the more poverty will increase in low-income countries. As far as Saudi is concerned, I can tell you we no longer focus on the total GDP number, because total GDP has two components mainly, the oil GDP and non-oil GDP. Our focus, the whole Vision 2030, is about diversifying the economy outside the oil industry. So we look at the non-oil GDP. The non-oil GDP has been growing and actually continuing to be very healthy. We are likely to see that to continue in the medium term. The last quarter, the non-oil GDP grew at 6.1%, and we are likely to end the year around 6%, and hopefully next year and the year after around that number. Fragmentation is not good for us and for others, and this is why we work very closely with other friendly nations and multilateral institutions, whether through the G20 or IMF, World Bank, Islamic Development Bank, and other institutions, to make sure that we encourage more collaboration. Because without it, it's going to be a very difficult world.
Your Excellency, what's your view on this? Because the GCC has experienced multiple shocks before and proven resilient. Is this any different?
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to extend my thanks to Mohammed for having us here today. It's always wonderful to be in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and great to be reminded in these times of the optimism of looking forward and ensuring that we double down on the development path, regardless of the difficulties geopolitically, globally, that exist. The great thing about the economies in the Gulf countries is that today we are seeing a development path that is rapidly moving towards diversification across all of the economies in the Gulf. And the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has made huge strides in that regard. And in the Kingdom of Bahrain, we are already at 83% of GDP is non-oil GDP. And that has been a development path that Bahrain has been on for a long time. That type of diversification really creates resilience in the economy and means that when certain sectors suffer because of one trend or another globally, other sectors are able to pick up on that. And when we look at the GCC today, already GCC GDP is north of $2.3 trillion annually, conservatively estimated to go to over $3 trillion annually by 2030, and conservatively estimated to go north of $6 trillion annually by 2050. That is an amazing development story on a global level. And that diversification is really linked to policy, deregulating certain sectors, opening up other sectors, incentivizing other sectors. And so therefore the momentum around that development path is so big, and we have to maintain it, that it does, in a way, insulate us from global shocks, given its scale and given the speed at which it is happening. Even though there are headwinds sometimes, the speed at which it's moving and the size of it does insulate us in the region.
Your Excellency, Bahrain was among the first signatories of the Abraham Accords, though. So I'd like your take on this. Do you see this as a significant step back in regional efforts to build bridges across economies?
It's extremely important in the region that we continue to build bridges. And the future of this region is a region, the future of this region and its stability and its security is built on providing opportunity for all. And that is what will underpin a secure, safe region in which we are delivering prosperity for all and delivering hope and opportunity. And that is what we need to continue to focus on. And the traditional lines that have existed, that have been lines of previous generations, I like to call them, those could be ethnic lines, those could be religious lines, are all now lines that we have to not look at, but we have to look at a line between those who are looking forward to building and ensure that those are the people that we are empowering and that they determine the future. And on the other side of the line, where there are people who are looking to destroy, that they are not part of writing that future. The people who should write the future are the builders in the region. And that's what we need to ensure we are empowering.
Madam Managing Director, welcome into the conversation. How is the IMF assessing the economic spillover so far and the risk of economic fragmentation?
What we have witnessed over the last years is that unquestionably we are in a more shock-prone world. And that requires from countries to adapt to that world rather than pretend that somehow it does not exist. The most important lesson we learned from the pandemic was that countries with strong fundamentals, like people with strong immune systems, withstood the shock better. So the number one recommendation we have at the fund is for countries to relentlessly pursue the reforms that bring strength in a more uncertain world we live in. The second is the role of international cooperation, and Minister Al-Jadaan already talked about fragmentation. This is truly a matter of highest priority to recognize and deal with it. We look at the costs of fragmentation. They are very significant. We have on numerous occasions demonstrated that we are talking about chopping up to 12% of the global GDP. Just imagine what we can do as a world with additional 12, 13, 14 trillion dollars. We look at what has happened in the last years. In 2017, trade restrictions were 500, and we were saying, oh, this is too many. Today, they're 3,000. I know it is not easy, but wisdom has to prevail. And in multilateral organizations, we fully recognize our huge responsibility to keep our membership together. And actually, we were just in Marrakesh. First time in 20 years, the annual meetings were in an Arab country. First time in half a century on the continent of Africa. What Morocco has proven is the capacity to bring the world together. And we have taken decisions that are significant for the stability that we need. Looking at the current conjuncture, where are we? Growth is slow, 3%, and remains slow for years to come. Inflation is still high, that requires interest rates to remain high. Throwing more cold water on growth. Who in their right mind would then further impact negatively our prospects for growth by fragmenting the world economy? So please, come to your senses, all of us. And we now have a very tragic moment for people affected by the war that erupted since October 7th. Devastating for the families that have suffered losses. Terrible in terms of economic prospects for the epicenter of the war. Negative impact on the neighbors through trade channels, tourism channels, cost of insurance, and more jittery world, more anxiety in the world. So we are here in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, its neighbor. It is a place where more than any other in the world, that recognition that the sooner there is a resolution, the better for people, for the region, for the world. What we can do as an institution is to show the impact short-term and the risks medium-long-term. And again, appeal for peace, appeal for reason.
Thank you, Madam Managing Director. Really important commentary and also hard to disagree with. Andrew Griffith, to you next. The UK is a really important foreign policy actor in the region, and we're happy you're here as well. What's the UK view on this, and how are you assessing the potential impact on UK Middle East trade ties economics, and the relationship overall?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Good morning, everybody. Look, first of all, like all of our other panelists, the UK's thoughts go out to everybody who's innocent and has been caught up on either side of the border since the 7th of October. It's very important that the UK makes its contribution from a humanitarian perspective, and the Prime Minister has announced earlier this week £30 million immediate aid to help those in Gaza. The biggest UK contribution I think we can make, and you referred to, is both from a foreign policy perspective as a P5 member of the United Nations. The Defence Secretary is actually, I believe, meeting right now here in Saudi. But also our contribution in terms of two things. One is that when people seek to divide us, exactly as Kristalina said, it's important more than ever that we stand together. And the UK stands with those who seek to do that through international and multilateral organizations, through standard-setting bodies, so that our capital markets, just as they have done through COVID and through Ukraine, albeit with some inhibitions as we've sought to sanction Russia and ensure that values basis in financial markets continues to operate, but to make sure that the UK's prodigious capital markets that so many people access continue to operate well at these difficult times. And finally, to continue to promote that voice of high quality standards, but also openness. The UK's history in markets has always been one of fundamental openness to the world. So we put our capital markets, our standard bodies at the service of those who are seeking to help the global south, seeking to finance the transition to a clean, low-carbon economy, and those who, at this very difficult time for citizens, are trying to deliver the growth and prosperity that we all need.
Thank you, Andrew. Minister Şimşek, what is Turkey's role in addressing this conflict, and how are you assessing the spillover so far?
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, I'd like to thank our host for the excellent organization and warm hospitality. Our heart also goes out to those innocent people who have suffered. Of course, we're doing our best to de-escalate and to put an end to this violence. The direct implications are limited, but we are more worried about long-term implications. You know, we live in a world that shocks and uncertainty seems to be the new norm. But what's happening in our region today increases the risk of radicalization. That's really the biggest worry that we have, because at a time when you see UN not functioning the way it's supposed to be, and governments unable to stop the violence. So clearly, that's one worry that we have in terms of medium long term. I think we should all, as previous speakers have highlighted, we all have to work very hard to contain and to de-escalate. And the long-term solution is really a peaceful coexistence. Our region has seen enough suffering, enough bloodshed, enough wars. It's time to rebuild together. And I think it's important that we go down that path. I was actually scheduled to be in Tel Aviv, literally, I think it was 9th or 10th, ahead of the Marrakesh meetings, because there was a regional conference, how to build the region. And that, where we are today is clearly very different. So the best hope we have is de-escalation, in the short run, and after that, a peaceful settlement in a way that we have a viable Palestinian state and a secure Israeli state.
Thank you all for addressing that issue. And I think we can move our conversation forward now to talking about some of the solutions and in particular unpacking this issue of economic fragmentation. Beyond those geopolitical tensions, economic fragmentation can also be driven by key issues like trade barriers, protectionist policies, a lack of policy independence or economic sanctions. And this is something that you've all spoken about. Your Excellency, Al-Jadaan, how else is geopolitical and geoeconomic fragmentation driving challenges for policymakers, and what is the appropriate response?
Well, it's a very serious challenge. I can tell you it doesn't help, and I think Kristalina in the earlier session this morning mentioned this. It doesn't really help with the current situation to have more restriction on trade, and more even restriction on imports. That will add to inflation. A lot of countries are actually suffering from inflation big time. Between 2019 and today, I think about 24 low-income countries are having to pay now more than 10% on their interest rate, sovereign interest rate. That's a lot of money, which means basically they need to grow for more than 10% for them to compensate, which is impossible. It doesn't actually help to continue this fragmentation. I think there is a more clearer realization now that fragmentation is harmful not only to others that you want to harm, but actually it harms your own economy. If you live in a world of island mentality where you think you can survive alone, that is not practical and it doesn't work. What we need, and actually I am seeing more and more realization now that fragmentation is harmful even to those who thought it is helpful for their own economy. I was really moved by the fact that the US have sent, I think, 5 or 6 different delegations to China to resume discussions and trying to de-escalate. There are a lot of discussions within multilateral institutions to try and de-escalate fragmentation and dialogue. I was, if I wanted to take a more optimistic view, I was very pleased with our meetings in Marrakesh. Despite the fact that we have a war in Ukraine, despite the fact that while we were meeting in Marrakesh, the events of Israel and Gaza happened, actually the international community managed to come together and agree that, for example, the IMF resources need to be increased. And we agreed the capital increase of 50%. We agreed to seriously consider more participation from Africa into the executive board of the IMF. This is the same world that we are talking about fragmentation impacting it. Actually, when it is difficult, people come together and act. And hopefully, we will not wait until we see another COVID for us to come together again. We need to be prepared, and we need to make sure that we don't actually impact even more negatively a negative environment that we live in.
Because you mentioned it, with regards to the US-China relationship, is this something that you're particularly concerned about? Saudi Arabia has a critical security partner on one side in the United States, and in China, a critical economic partner. How do you see that relationship evolving mid to near term?
Our position is actually very clear. We build bridges, and we want to continue building bridges. And if there are opportunities that we can make the relationship even between the West and China, the US and China, better, we will. We enjoy a very important and strategic relationship with the US, and we enjoy a very good relationship with China. They are our largest trading partner. So we need to maintain that relationship, and we need to maintain building bridges and making sure that we keep communicating, even with those that we may not agree with everything with them.
Your Excellency, can you speak to that as well? And how do we address the issue of economic fragmentation?
Thank you, and I think I'll point to an op-ed written by His Excellency, Minister Al-Jadaan, in which he said we have to tend the garden of multilateralism, and that stuck in my mind. And when we look at the multilateral institutions framework that we have today, it is really a construct of coming out of World War II. That is by and large the backbone of the global multilateral institutional framework. It's always important to ensure that we are updating that framework to ensure that it is relevant not only to the challenges but also to the opportunities of each decade, and that is a constant process. I mentioned to Kristalina and to Ajay, I think we are in the sphere of finance, so I think it is a much more straightforward job we have in terms of the multilateral financial institutions and updating them. It's much more difficult when we look at other multilateral institutions globally. They have a much larger challenge in terms of ensuring that they get that done. But ensuring that we have that relevance is important, and different challenges emerge. And as policymakers at the international level, at the country level, we have to focus everything on delivery. You have the best laid plans sitting on the shelves of government entities all over the world. You have the best ideas sitting in the brains of entrepreneurs all over the world. Actually getting those plans, those studies off the shelf of Ministry X or Ministry Y, wherever it is in the world, and turning it into a project that sees the light of day is the policy challenge. And with the private sector, getting it from the heads of executives, entrepreneurs, idea makers, the ideas are there. Getting them and translating them to reality is the challenge and we need the multilateral institutions to play a positive role in that daily process that we have to do around the world.
Can I add to His Excellency? I think you need also two things. You need stable governments
Yes.
that takes long-term view, and bold leaders who are able to take difficult decisions.
Absolutely.
And with this, I think, too, you will actually see success. And we are seeing it clearly, not because it was easy, because we had to take bold decisions and you had to take long-term view on things. And I think the same applies across.
Kristalina, can you speak to this as well? Because you wrote a fantastic piece, I think it was in Foreign Policy, about the risks of economic fragmentation. And if you haven't read it, do take a look, because it is a brilliant piece, and congratulations on that, because it created waves, and I know a lot of journalists, including myself, are following it closely. In the piece, you explained that we live in a world where there's no shortage of risks, and we're talking about them today. Economic imbalances, financial vulnerabilities, geopolitical, plus climate instability as well, which we should also talk about. When you have such a big in-tray, how do you prioritize what requires urgent attention?
The most important issue for us to focus on is why we need an integrated global economy, and how in this integrated global economy, individual countries take responsibility for their actions, for their own citizens, and for the world as a whole. And I could not agree more with what Minister Al-Jadaan and what actually everybody on the panel is talking about, the role of sound policies and strong institutions. I lived most of my life on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I know firsthand two things: the cost of bad policies. We had this economy that was illusion, and of course it went bankrupt. And also what I know from this experience is the human cost of a divided world. When we look into today and tomorrow, you ask what we should prioritize. First and foremost, we should prioritize responsibility for sound macroeconomic and financial policies that provide the foundation for growth, employment, and prosperity. And all of us here, many of you in this room, we bear this responsibility. It may be tough. Some of these policy actions are very difficult. Finance authorities, we are advocating for building strong buffers through tax policies that guarantee revenues and expenditure policies that guarantee investment in human capital, investment in long-term prosperity. And it is not easy to do. But then we have a second responsibility, and frankly, we sometimes shy away from it. And it is to speak truth to power. Why has the world turned against globalization? Why there is populism that says, I do not want it anymore, despite the fact that the world economy tripled as a result of globalization and 1.5 billion people were lifted out of poverty? Because not everybody benefited, and we were too shy to admit there are winners, but there are also losers in society, and we have not done our job properly to secure opportunities for people that were on the losing side. Today, our responsibility is to point to the terrible impact a fragmented world would have on our children and our grandchildren. And I want to ask the audience, how many of you think that a fragmented world is better for your children, better for your grandchildren? Raise a hand. Who thinks it is better for us to be divided? No one. How many of you think that the united world is both a richer world and more secure world? Raise a hand. So we have to act on that belief. And I can tell you, the way I think about it is make that responsibility personal. Yeah. My responsibility is to my 190 members. Keep them together. And I'm proud in Marrakesh we had great outcome despite a fragmentation. So make it personal and do a simple thing. I do it every time I'm faced with a difficult decision. I put the picture of my granddaughter and my grandson. I look at them and I ask myself, what is the right thing to do for them? So have these pictures handy.
I wanted to shift our conversation and focus more on specific policy areas as it relates to the UK and as it relates to Turkey. Minister Şimşek, first to you, it does seem as if Turkey has been on quite a significant economic turnaround since President Erdogan won the election in May, but the credibility of the country's economic policies have been called into question. International investors still aren't necessarily buying the independence of the government's ministry. In your ministry, they're not necessarily buying the independence of the central bank. Why do you think that's so? And what's the pathway forward here? What's your message to the international investment community about the state of Turkey's economy and this question of independence of the central bank and the independence of your ministry?
Well, thank you. Turkey is back with a new program, a new team. Political uncertainty is out of the way. So we have 5 years ahead of us. There is a new team at Central Bank, and they're doing what is needed, what it takes to control inflation and bring it down back to single digits. We have a program to that end. You know, it's easy to lose trust, confidence, or credibility, but it takes time to regain in terms of policy. We had issues with our monetary policy framework, if you look at the past several years, but actions speak louder than words. We're rebuilding it by actually rebuilding credibility by delivery. We front-loaded fiscal adjustment in tune of 2.5% of GDP in July. That should help restore fiscal health. There is conventional monetary tightening in addition to selective credit tightening, as well as quantitative tightening. So that should help anchor inflation expectations going forward. We've also unveiled a very comprehensive structural reform agenda that is tied to a calendar so that market participants can judge us, can judge our performance. So I think we do have what it takes to regain the trust of people, the confidence, and investors will be back. It takes time, but already there are a few signs. Reserves are up by $26 billion US. CDS are down by 300 basis points. So across the board, there are good signs, but we have to continue, we have to sustain it. So really the key is patience and perseverance. And we believe that we have the backing of President Erdogan, and therefore the concerns about longevity of the program and the efforts are probably misplaced.
Inflation's still at around 60%. The interest rate is at 30%. The lira has been one of the worst performing currencies this year. What does normal look like in Turkey, and how soon before you can get there?
Thank you. It's true, we are an outlier when it comes to inflation. I think it would be misplaced to compare the policy rate with past 12 months inflation. What is important is that we look at the policy rate relative to the next 12 months inflation expectations. In that sense, the gap is much narrower, which suggests that the work is not done, that we still have some way to go. Also, I would highlight that the monetary policy stance is tighter than what headline policy rate implies because of the quantitative tightening and selective credit tightening. So in that sense, we're not done, but we are better than what headline numbers would suggest. So inflation, what is the new normal? The new normal is you implement sound policies that generate confidence. This will ultimately lead to portfolio and FDI inflows, flows into Turkey, and that would lead to real exchange rate appreciation, which would foster speedier disinflation. So that's really the game plan, and I think we're on track because we are implementing sound policies.
Thank you, Minister Şimşek. And Andrew, over to you on a similar question and a similar problem. Inflation 6.7% in September in the UK. Clearly, the cost of living crisis also reverberating down to average everyday people there. We've seen 14 consecutive rate increases, yet to have a material impact on that inflation print. What is the pathway forward, and why can't policymakers in the UK get a handle on this?
Well, we do have a handle on it. The UK economy has been very resilient. It came out of the COVID pandemic strongly. We've been one of the fastest growing G7 economies in Europe for the last couple of years, and that strong demand has obviously created challenges in the supply chain, as we've seen elsewhere. We've got tight labour markets, and a lot of, as well as the monetary policy interventions from the Bank of England, running a very disciplined, making those tough choices that Kristalina talked about. We've also been looking at the supply side of the economy, and in particular labour. How do you get people back to work? How can you mobilise more of the female participation through things like childcare support? And how can you drive more productivity from public spending so we get more for the same? Something I suspect everybody on the panel would like to do is take that, in our case, about 40% of the money that's spent in the economy and deliver either more outputs for the same amount or the same outputs for less. But the economy is very resilient. We're on track to halve inflation this year, which was the challenge the Prime Minister set, the Chancellor and the Treasury team. And thereafter, although these things are never in a straight line, the medium-term prospects for growth of the UK economy are strong. Can I just pick up on the very spirited and brilliant intervention from Kristalina? You talked about the challenges to fragmentation. And I think everyone in this room has agency, not just those of us who are here from sovereigns, but also investors. Because one of the challenges as we look to drive productive investment is making sure that we get the balance right. And I think, when we look at, governments making fiscal, there's a lot of things that are happening under the transition, the huge transition to a sustainable, low-carbon economy. But those that, the forces against or would like to see more fragmentation, could also look at this to smuggle in, fiscal preferments, carbon border adjustments, and in this room, ESG. Now, we all support responsible investing. We all want sustainable investing, but we've also got to finance the transition, and it's important that we get the balance right. So I think there's conversations to have as we look at trying to align things like international sustainability standards. We could go one of two ways. We could try and be aligned at a global level and allow capital to move freely, or you could end up with conflicting standards on an individual market basis. And I think that would be very deleterious for what we're trying to achieve.
Well, on that note, unfortunately, we are out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. But I wanted to thank all of our panelists, including His Excellency Mohammed Al-Jadaan, for hosting us today and for contributing to the conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please make them feel welcome.